My name is Görrel Espelund. I'm the host. I would like to ask everyone a very warm welcome, wherever you are in the world, if it's morning, afternoon, evening. I'm very happy to welcome all of you to Water and Communications Workshop Series 2024. There are some familiar faces that I'm happy to see back and many, many new ones, and welcome to all of you. We have our producer, Cecile Pilon-Hugh. She will take care of all the technical issues, and I will be your host throughout this series. This year, for the first time, we are introducing Spanish translations. And to tune into your very preferred language, just follow these instructions. You will soon see them on the screen. In the bottom menu, you can select the globe icon, and it might be located under More menu. You can select English to hear the original audio, or you select Spanish to hear the translation. If you have any questions during these sessions or to the speaker after the sessions, just write them in the chat box, either in English or in Spanish, and we will do our best to answer all the questions. As I said, many of you are connecting from various places around the globe, and I think it would be fantastic and very nice to see from where you are connecting. So please write your country in the chat box, and we see where we are all sitting today. Water and Communications has been developed in cooperation with the Grundfos Foundation, and this year we are focusing on the World Water Week theme, Bridging Borders, Water for a Peaceful and Sustainable Future. I think that's all for me, and it's now my honor to introduce to you the very first speaker of Water and Communications 2024, and we have Philip Beetlestone. Welcome. You are Director of Water Cooperation and Diplomacy at SIWI, and you are going to unpack the complexities of water for us today, and then we will see you again back at the very last day with a wrap-up session for the whole of workshop series. Philip, welcome very much, and over to you.
My name is Philip Beetlestone. I'm the Director of Water Cooperation and Diplomacy within the Stockholm International Water Institute. Today, again, my task has been to sort of outline sort of water and sort of the complexities of water, sort of to frame the discussions going on in the coming weeks. Sort of the question is coming from, it's like, why does water play such a critical role for cooperation and peace? I'm not going to focus on cooperation and peace at this point in time, because I think we'll unpack that in the coming weeks. But what I want to do is unpack the complexities of water, look at how is water interconnected, and what pressures is water facing today, and finally, what are the impacts and how they ripple globally. So without further ado, again, the thought is to just take you through a small sort of look at quotations through time from varying people. If we look at the top left, it's like water is the driving force of nature. That's Leonardo da Vinci. The next one is John E. Thorsten. He's actually a judge working in adjudication with water rights. He put forward, water links us to our neighbor in a way more profound and complex than any other. Going further to the right, and Benjamin Franklin basically said, when the well is dry, we know the value of water. And finally, with Lao Tzu, he who controls the water supply controls the people. These are all very different perspectives of water. But again, it shows the importance of water as we go forward. So the question is, why focus on water? Why is water important? As more than likely a lot of you know already, but I'll just reiterate for some of you that might not, is of all the water in the world, essentially 97% is salt water and is in the oceans. Of that 3%, which is fresh water, most of that is locked up in glaciers. Of course, it's changing with climate change at this point in time, which is a concern. 29% of that is groundwater, which is accessible, but again, costly, but it's something we have to think about. And most of all, where we see most of our water that we use is about less than 1%, and that sits in rivers and lakes. So you start to see where water is very restricted. There's a lot of water in the earth, but access to it is quite challenging. Why is this of concern? Is if you look at what, as a human, what we're made up of 70% water. Not just humans, but essentially all organisms are dependent on water. So this sort of puts it in perspective. Even though there's little access available, we all need it. Be it for drinking. Sometimes there's too much, sometimes there's too little. We need it for cattle, we need it for agriculture, and we just need it for daily purposes of our lives. So it's something that's ever present. Sometimes we take it for granted, but at the end of the day, we need it to survive. And why is this important? We have water. If you think about water, it's something that we take for granted, as I said before, and it's in every present of what we do, and it is around us. That's why we can look at water and think water is what we would call a wicked problem. A wicked problem is a set of problems that are very hard to solve. They're unique. They are, there is no end to these problems, because once you solve it, another one pops up. There is no right or wrong. It's only better or worse, because there are always trade-offs, because everybody needs this. So how do you start to look at water in this type of framing that you can't really solve it, but you have to do the best you can? Other types of wicked problems we have is poverty, climate change, education, homelessness, sustainability. All of these are problems that change. As you find one solution, there's another solution or another problem popping up. So it's this continually, how do you adapt these problems? So that's what makes water interesting, at least for me. It's because it's an evolving problem. It's never stationary. We all have we always need it, but we always have to adapt. So I wanted to show this slide, which is the hydrologic cycle. It's extremely complex and shows you the nature of water. And about the evaporation in the earth, where the water comes from, where it's going into the mountains, and how it goes down all the way back to the sea, and how it cycles around. But that's too complex. But I just want to show you how complex it can be. But more simply, we're looking at where water comes down into the mountains, or in the high spots, how it moves through the land system, and then how does it go back to the sea, and then how it comes back up. That's a hydrologic cycle, or the water cycle, which is important as we go into the discussion today. Because this and how water falls on the land and how it moves through the land is extremely important, and how it interacts with societies and also with nature as we continue. As humans, we all, again, say 15, 20 people, put them into the same room and ask them the same question. What do you think about water? How do you value water? I wouldn't get the same answer, because each of us have different values and perceptions when it comes to water. For example, some people view it as a very spiritual connection. Some people just see it as, this is a media that I can use for transport, or that I need for my health, or that for my children to have and to be part of, or I need it for cultural ceremonies. Or again, it's part of our sovereign right as a country to have this water. So every person you talk to has a different perspective on water. And this is also what makes water fascinating, but actually very interesting and complex. Because when you're talking in a group, we each see it as a different perspective, and we also place a different value, which means the discussions that we go into are quite different. So I think working in the water space, and also when you're writing stories about it, is start thinking about these different perspectives and perceptions of who you're writing to, but also who are the other participants in this discussion. So more importantly, values and perceptions differ greatly from person to person. So looking at water, sort of how is it interconnected to what we do in our daily lives? Again, I don't know if all of you are familiar with the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, but on the left side is just an image of the Sustainable Development Goals, looking at how interconnected they are. At the base, you'll see that water, which is SDG 6, life on land and life below water is all in that biosphere, which is all dependent on water in one way or another. Then you go to the next level, which is more about society, looking at poverty, sort of nutrition, sort of education, peace and justice. That's the next level, but there's not, again, and water feeds into that. To be able to achieve those goals, necessary. And then, of course, at the top, you look at the economy, and then going even higher, so society, and then looking even higher at the economy. But all of those, water underpins all of those. So no matter what we do to achieve the goals, water is going to be a factor in that. Looking at the right side of this slide, when we look at the risks that society is going to be facing in the next year, the World Economic Forum each year puts out the top 10 list. It's sort of like an album. But over the next 10 years, they see the top risks are extreme weather events, critical change to earth systems, biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse, and natural resources. That is Switzerland with the Alps. That's where the snow is collected and also precipitation falls. And then, of course, it moves down through Germany, through France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and into the Netherlands. But as it progresses through the catchment, again, it passes not just one country, but several countries. And within those countries, it passes through several cities, several states, and each of these states adds complexity to water and how you govern water, because each country views it a certain way. For example, in the next one on the left, we can take the Nile Basin. Likewise, the water falls predominantly in Uganda and Kenya, and then flows into Egypt. Most of the water is collected towards the southern portion, which is Uganda, and then flows into Sudan, Ethiopia, and then gets into Egypt. But as we go down, it becomes more arid. So that presents challenges for us. On the right, if we look at the Baltic Sea is surrounded by, again, multiple countries, Sweden, Finland, Latvia, Lithuania. But whatever each of those countries do on land, for example, agriculture, industry, the river systems within each of those countries take whatever pollutants flow into those rivers, and it all ends up in the Baltic Sea, which, as we know with the Baltic, is quite polluted and actually is facing challenges. This is another aspect of water. We can't just sort of dump into the oceans or dump into the seas anymore, because what happens on land ends up in the oceans, which at the end sort of looks at fisheries. How does it affect fisheries? How does it affect the ecosystems within seas and oceans? So you can't take water in a context by itself. You have to look at it in a broader context, because it plays out in different ways. Now, looking at the idea of, I talked about the Rhine Valley, I talked about the Nile. Those we consider transboundary waters. This is where we start touching on a bit of some of the content for the workshop, for the World Water Week on peace and security. But transboundary waters play a very important part, because many countries, again, have rivers flowing through them, or they are the head of the rivers for the mountains. For example, Lesotho or Switzerland, basically that's where water is for the river. And then that flows into other countries. Essentially, 2 billion people live in these basins. Again, there are about 276. Some are quite small, but some of them are the largest ones. There's the Amazon, there's the Nile, there's the Mekong. So some of them are quite large. But again, 40% of the world's population relies on the activities within those basins. So this idea of transboundary and the plays between countries, but also plays between states, is quite important as we go forward. What this looks at, this slide here, is another aspect of water. For societies, we might be sovereign from our countries, but there is an independence with us. For example, if you look at the image here, the darker countries are highlighted in sort of more of a dark red, almost brown, and to those which are in the lighter, in more yellow. The darker ones are very dependent on water outside their boundaries. So for example, Egypt, just to take Egypt as a very easy example, because we've been talking about the Nile, is highly dependent on water coming from the Ugandan highlands, and also and in Sudan. So that is a country which is very highly dependent on water from outside, but it is not necessarily in control of those resources. So you have to look towards of how do they manage those resources. So this is another complexity of water. And finally, water is a vehicle. It transports whatever we put on land or whatever we put into it, it transports it through a system, through the river system, and eventually ends up in the oceans. For example, power plant discharge, for example, that's more of hot waters that actually affects the temperature of a system. There's untreated sewage that goes into the rivers in many places. There's unregulated dumping, litter, industrial effluent. All of these are having impact on the water quality and also life within these rivers. And ultimately, it ends up in the ocean, which actually does have an impact on the quality of oceans, the acidity of the oceans, and also fisheries, for example. I'll come back to this towards the end. But water by itself, we are actually, with the populations we've had in the past, there has been enough water. And in the earth, there might be enough water, but it's not necessarily spatially in the right place at the right time. So water faces a lot of pressures because of this spatial variability. There are two types of pressures water can face. One is physical. That's, for example, that's climate change. Climate change being long-term trends, like the temperature changes, what we talk about, or climate variability from year to year. The weather changes from year to year. You might be in a short-term drought and then also a long-term moist period. There's urbanization, population. There's excessive use by countries or areas. There's environmental degradation, how we use the land from our land use, land cover. But there's also infrastructure. The infrastructure that we put in place has a lifespan and it actually starts to degrade. So it's these types of pressures from a physical side, they're easy to quantify and actually identify. That's on the left side. But on a side which is more challenging is the political pressures that water faces. For example, water, again, defines, or how do you say, is viewed as sovereign. It's, again, if I have the water is mine to use. National policies, transboundary water, for example, we talked about, where I might basically need water, but it's not within my bounds. So that question of sovereignty comes into play. What are the perceptions on economic development? How do you view that as a country? That also has an impact. Say if you're an upstream country and you decide to take all the water for your use, but not release any waters downstream, that impacts other countries within your region, which also plays out in, for example, peace and security, peace and stability, potential migration. There's also, for example, geopolitical strategies of a country. How does that play out? There's also water rights. For example, some countries have water rights, others do not, and some have water rights that they view are set in stone, and therefore are not willing to give up those rights because they have been set maybe 100 years ago, 200 years ago, but the situation has changed. So these types of political pressures are variable and also depending on individual groups or individual countries and their perception and their desires. So this is another aspect on water that one has to consider when reporting on water. So both these sides, the physical side and the political side, you can't separate them. If you talk about one, you must look at the other one to understand the context within water. Finally, we have the competing needs of water. Water is vital, as I said, it's vital for societies, it's vital for economies, vital for the environment. So we have competing needs for this limited resource. And also it's, as I said, it's spatially irregular. It doesn't always flow in one place. There'll be dry spaces, areas, there'll be wet areas, they'll have, and that will vary through time. And the amount it varies as well. But it is also the primary vector or mechanism that we feel climate change. So as climate change starts to persist, we start to see more floods, we start to see more droughts, in turn, with the droughts come fires. So there always this link. We feel climate change through water by either too much, too little, or too late. But looking at the competing needs of water we need it for food, we need it for power, we need it for our industries, we need it for our economy, our health, and our environment. But it's limited. So how do you make trade-offs between these different needs, which we all need and societies need at some point? So where do you put more weight or less weight? And this is the other challenge when it comes to water, because we don't have enough to balance water for all of these. There are a few countries that might be lucky enough to have that opportunity, but in general, most countries are not that lucky to have an abundance of water that they can address all their needs. So looking at water, we call it, there's the dilemma of water. We all need it, but I'll just bring in the idea of the tragedy of common pool resources, or global common good as water is. It's not owned by anyone, so individuals or individual groups use it for their own interest, but they don't necessarily manage it as a whole for the common good. So what you see is, in the short term, you might get what you need, but in the long term, the resource for themselves, but also for others, is degraded. This comes into the idea of sovereignty and how water and sovereignty are inextricably linked. There's also the transboundary of how you bring in the challenges of this dilemma. It's one country against another, or even in-country, intra-transboundary. There's also water use. One area affects another. For example, where water evaporates in one area, that might be hundreds of miles or thousands of miles away where the rain from that evaporation might fall. So that's another aspect of water. Different countries have different priorities. For example, a country might focus power, water, and food, and that's what their priority is. Another group might say environment and biodiversity is our priority. So these alternate priorities are in conflict. And so how do you resolve these? And I think that's when you go through the next few weeks, we'll be looking to how do you start to unpack some of this. And also downstream countries, riparian countries, like, for example, Egypt, are impacted by the actions of those upstream. Finally, I'm running low on time, but I just want to say water, again, has many aspects. It links to tourism, trade, transport, food systems, oceans, migration, health. All of this is an integral part. If water is too little or too late, one of these will be affected in some manner. So you need to look at the whole. I say, how does water relate to trade, etc.? In closing, what I'll do is I just want to look at a few articles to see how does water play out. For example, if you look at the top left, dangerously low on water. Cape Town faces day zero. That's an economic challenge and also a health challenge for the city of Cape Town, because there was not enough water, and they're getting to the point that they had not enough water to sustain the city. So that would be day zero. Or, for example, power generation halted due to water scarcity. It's an economic, that's lack of water. There's also, from example, health, the vanishing aerial sea, health consequences of an environmental disaster because the aerial sea is drying up. Again, the wind picking up the toxic dust, again, introducing to cause cancers, lung infections, etc. That's one of the other sides. For example, I'll touch on this one for a second. This is Toyota profits hit by floods in Thailand. In 2011, there was a flood in Thailand that essentially wiped out or inundated microprocessor facility. That one event over the year actually had a 2% impact on global GDP. So essentially reduced global GDP by 2%. So even though your country or where you live might not be affected by water, where something takes place might affect you because of the global nature of our economies. And then finally, I just wanted to show, these are some of just pictures. Again, they're sea snot to your mucilage, which is caused by fertilizers in water coming from the glands. There's drought for transportation. There's rubbish in the rivers from just trash. And then there's also, here on the right is also looking at tailings from mining that failed, all because of water. But from a story perspective, don't just focus on the negative. They are these positive stories. They're for example, biodiversity, the protection of biodiversity and how that plays out, or this provision of water to change people's lives. We have a tendency to focus on the sort of the sensationalist stories and also the negative stories, but they are these beautiful, positive stories as well. From the presentation, I think the takeaways would be, one, water is a wicked problem. To understand how water links to a story, look at the underlying factors. It's not just the water, but how does it link to society and how does that play out? Or how does it link to the land use, land cover, or the variability of water? There are many sides to a story. It's not just one story from one perspective. Look at the different perspectives from individuals or individual groups. I think for the discussion that's going to be coming up in the few weeks, water can be a point of conflict, but more often, again, I'll say that, but more often is a point for cooperation than conflict. And I think when we use the term conflict, that is in the broad sense of conflict, not war. But again, it's basically two groups misunderstanding each other or needing to come to an understanding. When you're reporting on water, look beyond the initial reactive story. Look into the geopolitics, the environment, the economy, and the climate to frame that story, because it is usually not about the water at the end of the day. That's what I mean, go beyond the immediate area of a story and look to the catchment perspective, because what happens in that catchment between countries plays out in your story. What I think I wanted to put forward is water at the end of the day is a human story. Either how we impact the water, either how we, through the water, impact biodiversity, or the land, or the ocean. So at the end of the day, water is a human story, be it positive, be it negative.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. I think that is a fantastic way of ending this very first presentation at our workshops. Water is a human story. We do have like 2 minutes before our next speaker. So if any of you have any question to Philip, please write it in the chat. But I would like to ask you, is there any one story that is on your wish list that you would like to read or listen to?
It's actually nothing to do with big stories or little stories. This for me would be, each of us as individuals has a relationship and a story about water, how we grew up and how we feel water. So for me, that story that I would like to hear is each of us within this group or globally of what is our connection to water and how has it impacted our lives, or how could we actually make a change? What is the new story? What is the next story?
About water.
Yeah, what is it? Because it is the future. It is not stationary. It's looking forward as well. And how can we have that story going forward? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, because I think we need this framing to move forward in these coming weeks' workshop to understand, first of all, what are we actually talking about and the big complexity in it all. And thank you, Philip, for joining us. We'll see you again later on in the workshop series. And I'm now going to introduce our next speaker, Farah Hegazi, researcher, Climate Change and Risk Program at SIPRI. And Farah, you are going to dig a little bit deeper into one of the subjects here, climate change, human insecurity, and peace building. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody online. What I'm here to talk to you about today is climate change, human insecurity, and peace building. I am a researcher in the Climate Change and Risk Program at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, better known as SIPRI. And what I'll focus on is the relationship between climate change and conflict, and what we can do about it. But before I get to that, I'd first like to talk about the difference between climate exposure and climate vulnerability, because I think it's important to what comes next. So climate exposure. Climate exposure, this is essentially to what extent location experiences the physical effects of climate change. And so what I would like you guys to think about here is things like droughts, flood, sea level rise, changes to rainfall patterns, increasing temperatures. Yeah, again, just those physical impacts. So when we talk about climate vulnerability, what we mean is how that exposure interacts with the broader social, political, and economic context. And so what you should be thinking about here is things like governance broadly, but also natural resource governance, the types of livelihoods that people engage in, political stability at the national level and the subnational level, and again, just the bigger picture of what's happening in the context. And to show you, sort of to try and illustrate the difference between these two, I'm going to show you a map. So what you see on this map is different degrees, or the degree of exposure for different settings, for different countries. And so, I mean, the point here is not to figure out how these numbers are derived, but what I want you to take out of this is that these are all countries that have similar levels of exposure to climate effects. So Brazil, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Vietnam, very, very different contexts, but facing similar exposure levels. When you look at vulnerability, what you see is a very different picture. So over here, lower numbers mean more vulnerability. So what you see is that even though Afghanistan and Vietnam have similar levels of exposure, Afghanistan is more vulnerable to the effects of climate change than Vietnam. And again, the point here is to be mindful of the broader context, and that these physical effects of climate change do not happen in a vacuum. And you'll see why this is important in a second. So what do we know about the research on climate change and conflict? Well, what we know is that climate change does increase the risk of violence and conflict, but it is not the only factor. As I was saying earlier, the context matters because the effects of climate change on security very much depend on that social, political, and economic context. So the term that we assign to this relationship between climate change and conflict is called climate-related security risks. I know that that's very long. We also say climate security for sort of a shorthand term. But essentially what these are the risks emerging from climate change to people's well-being and livelihoods that may have implications for social, political, and economic stability at different levels. And this can be at the community level, at the subnational level, and at the national level. It just depends on what perspective you want to take. So how do we navigate this? How do we sort of unpack the relationship between climate change and conflict? I'm going to show you a figure. So what we were talking about earlier over here, so over here on the left, you see climate change. Now, these are the physical effects of climate change that we were talking about earlier. And over here, you see vulnerability, or people's vulnerability. And then to the far right here, we have impacts on peace and security. Now, the way we make the connection between vulnerability and peace and security is through these pathways over here. And we call them the climate security pathways. And through research, our research has been able to identify 4 pathways through which climate change affects conflict or security. The first one is deteriorating livelihood conditions. The second is changes to migration and mobility patterns. The third is changes to the tactics of armed groups. And the fourth is elite exploitation and natural resource mismanagement. I'm going to go through each of these and give you an example. So on livelihood deterioration, what this is about is how climate change affects people's livelihoods and what the implications are for security. So in most parts of the world, people depend on, or people have livelihoods that are dependent on their natural resources. So they're farmers, for example, or they're herders, and what that means is that they depend on the rain coming at the right time and in the right amount, and also on having suitable temperatures, either for their crops to grow or for their livestock to survive. And what we've been seeing is that with changes in climate, we're seeing these changes to rainfall patterns. We're also seeing increases in temperature, and that has implications for people's livelihoods. In contexts where there are no alternative income sources, or where the government either doesn't want to respond to what people are experiencing or isn't able to respond to what people are experiencing, these affected groups may end up feeling marginalized, and that could increase their grievances, grievances against the government, which has potential to sort of create conflict or violence. The other part of this is conflict between communities. So if communities are experiencing deterioration to the availability of water, for example, then they're competing over increasingly scarce resources, and that could also lead to violence or tension between communities. One example that we use here is opium poppy in Afghanistan. So what's been happening, this is all research based on before the Taliban takeover. But what had been happening was that because of the conflict that Afghanistan had experienced and the effects and climate change affecting water resources or the availability of water resources, what farmers ended up doing was switching to growing opium poppy from traditional crops, because opium poppy is less water intensive and because it's more profitable, and that sort of directly feeds into or fed into Taliban's revenue sources. The second pathway is changes to migration and mobility patterns, and within this there are sort of 2 categories. One is changes to pastoral mobility patterns, and the other is the displacement of populations, so people moving. So on pastoral mobility patterns, or changing pastoral mobility patterns, what that means is that with changes in climate, what pastoralists have had to do is migrate earlier in the season and move to areas where they don't have agreement with farming communities to share resources. And so farmers and herders end up coming into conflict with each other. And we see this happen across West Africa and the Sahel region. On displaced populations, this is about the movement of people from one place to the other. And this could be movement within rural areas, but also movement from rural areas to urban areas. Sort of here, in no way am I saying that migration causes conflict, but it does have the potential to cause conflict between displaced people and host communities if host communities perceive the incoming population as a threat to either to their livelihoods or to their identity, or sort of whatever that may be. The other side of this is rural to urban migration, where people move into urban areas that don't necessarily have the ability to or to accommodate a large number of people coming in, because it places pressure on public services. And there is potential, if migrants feel that they're not getting sort of what they deserve or what they would like, for there to be tension or violence against the government. I'm dealing with allergies. The third pathway, armed group tactics. This is essentially about how climate change affects the dynamics of ongoing conflict. And here we talk about recruitment and a change in behavior of armed groups to sort of leverage climate pressures to advance their own agendas. On recruitment, it's very much related to the livelihoods pathway that I was mentioning earlier. We know that the #1 reason why people join armed groups is for economic reasons, essentially because they've lost their source of income, and armed groups offer an alternative. And with climate change, because it affects agricultural livelihoods, it does have the potential to increase recruitment into armed groups. On behavior change, as I said earlier, this is about armed groups leveraging circumstances to advance their own agendas. And what we see, or the example that we use here, is Al-Shabaab in Somalia, which has been able to take control of water points during a drought in Somalia and sort of control the distribution of water in communities. And then the final pathway is elite exploitation and natural resource management. And this is about the role of elites in regions or in areas that are exposed to the effects of climate change and that are also affected by conflict. And elites here is broad in the sense that it could be political elites or economic elites. And it's a bit similar to the armed groups pathway, in that elites will leverage changes to advance their own agenda by, for example, controlling disaster assistance when it comes in and distributing it to groups that they favor, or by occupying the land of displaced people after a flood or a drought. But they can also exploit vulnerable populations and recruit them, and essentially recruit them into the and one example of this is in the Brahmaputra floodplain, which had experienced floods, and so people ended up moving away. And what the local elites had done was hire private militias to take over people's land, so that when people came back, they weren't able to return to it. So I've talked about a lot of problems, but it's also good to talk about solutions, or at least start to talk about solutions. So if we go back to this figure that I had shown you earlier, we've just covered this part over here and how it relates to peace and security. And what I'd like to very briefly talk about is what's in this red box down here as entry points for responses to these issues that I was just describing. So there are a couple of ways to address this sort of two buckets of things. One is through addressing people's vulnerability, and that can be done through climate change adaptation and climate resilient development. That also has to be sensitive to conflict. So this could be things like diversifying people's livelihoods away from things that are climate dependent. And then in addressing the peace and security side, this is about conflict prevention, peacekeeping, peace building, but it has to be sensitive to climate change. So, for example, if you're setting up a peace agreement between two communities, then it needs two communities that have been fighting over, let's say, over water or pasture. then whatever agreement that's set up needs to be sensitive to what's coming in the future, or how climate change will affect things in the future. I'll leave it at that. And of course, I'm happy to take any questions or comments that you may have.
Thank you very much, Farah, for this very interesting presentation. We have a first question from Aurora here. Thanks for the presentation. Could you develop a bit more on the example of elite exploitation that you talked about? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Aurora. The way that I usually describe this, but I thought maybe I shouldn't be so blunt in this context, is that it really ends up being about corruption, and how politicians or economic elites are able to get what they want by exploiting people's vulnerabilities. Let me see if I can find another example that makes it a bit more clear than what I had explained. So if you think of the example that I gave with Al-Shabaab, for example, that you switch out Al-Shabaab for a government actor, or a political party that ends up getting control of disaster assistance coming in after a flood or a drought, what they can do and what they have been doing is distributing that assistance to their supporters at the expense of others. If that's not clear enough, please let me know, and I can try and clarify a bit more. You're muted, Johan.
Sorry, I was again unmuted. Hello, this is from Shivani. Hello, thanks for the presentation. Information related to pastoral communities and climate change is based on research data or anecdotal? Thank you very much. Farah?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Nothing that I've said today is based on anecdotal evidence. It's all based on systematic data collection and reviews of research, academic research that's been conducted, and I'm happy I can share some of the publications with you.
That would be great.
Links in the chat. Yeah, I'm happy to put the links in the chat.
You can put some links in the chat after your presentation. John are asking, what are your thoughts on carbon tax in combating climate change?
Yeah, I think, so I'll preface this by saying that's not my area of expertise. So this is a personal opinion. I think any tool that we can use to reduce the effects of climate change or mitigate the effects of climate change, we should use, as long as it's not creating adverse effects somewhere else. So we see this, for example, with carbon offset projects and how they end up doing more harm than good. So, yeah.
Right, thank you. Then I also have a question. Your presentation, I mean, we see that all the research, we can see that climate change increased the risk of violence and conflict, but climate change is not the only factor, it's very rarely the only factor. And looking into what we see from in international media, but also all kinds of reports and information, how do you feel that this, has this fact actually slipped through? I mean, are people aware, or is it often that you see oversimplified reports or articles?
Yeah, I think from what I read, it does tend to be oversimplified. I think if you take the example of Darfur, I think that
Sorry, the example of
Darfur in Sudan.
Darfur, yes.
Yeah, I think that was, I think it was the media that had said this is like the first climate war or something, if I remember correctly. But that's not actually true, because there's history there. It's not that, temperatures have changed or rainfall has changed and then people start fighting. There's a lot more complexity to it. I think the narrative around Syria has also been similar, in that it has been, or well, when the civil war broke out, it was that farmers had been experiencing droughts, and so they moved to the cities, and then you had protests and violence. But what you actually see from the research is that that's not the case. That farmers, yes, they had moved to cities, but then they also moved back to their homes, and so that relationship hasn't really been hasn't panned out in the way that it was portrayed in the media. So yeah, I do think there's oversimplification.
Right. Shikandi has a
but
question.
I understand.
Yes, Shikandi has a question, but I just like, before asking that question, I'd like to follow up on you, because if we do see a lot of oversimplifying reports and media reports, any tips or tricks or tools that you can share with us for us as journalists not to oversimplify? I mean, what shall we look into? What should we look out for?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can be as simple as you know, in the headline of the article. I once saw a headline in a news outlet, a media outlet, that had said climate change is causing terrorism. And if you read the actual article, that's not what it said. And I understand that journalists don't write their own headlines, but that, you know, it helps because people don't always read what's the whole thing. They read the headline. And I would also, and the other thing is that I understand that it's hard to convey complexity, and you're writing for a general audience, you're not writing for an expert audience, and sometimes you do need to simplify a little bit. But I would say to minimize that as much as possible. And just to make sure that from a reader's perspective, what you're writing is not climate change causes terrorism, but that there are more things happening that contribute to that.
So lift climate change and water as a contributing factor, but not as the factor, so to speak. All right. Now we take up Chikandi's question. Thank you for the presentation. Can you come again and clarify on linkages of armed group tactics and water, please?
Sorry, was that armed group tactics and water?
Armed group tactics and water, exactly.
Yeah, so that was an example that I had used for Al-Shabaab, but I'll take a step back and maybe re-explain the armed groups pathway. So within that, there are two ways that armed groups can leverage the effects of climate change for their benefit. One of them is through recruitment. And how that happens is when people lose their livelihoods, when they're no longer able to engage in agriculture or in pastoralism or in fishing to feed themselves and their families, and they have no other alternative by which to make an income, armed groups offer an alternative because they will pay you. They will pay you a salary, basically. And so people join them because they have no other option. The second part of this is the sort of the tactic, the control that armed groups can gain through the changes that climate change causes. So, and this was the example that I had mentioned with Al-Shabaab. So if you imagine a community that has been experiencing droughts because of climate change, and you have, and an armed group sees that there's a problem there, what they can do is decide to take over the water points, so take over the wells in a community, and they control how water is distributed and who water is distributed to. And what they tend to do is distribute to the whole community, so that they gain the community support and they gain legitimacy in that community.
And do you see these tactics, is that a growing trend? Do you see them in many conflicts all over the world?
Yeah, so I don't know if it's a growing trend or not, because this is, I would say, maybe the least researched area. But we see it, yeah, so we see it in Somalia, we see it in Mali, we see it even in Colombia. So it is something seems to be happening in many different places. But I would say that more research is needed on this. We also see it happen in Niger.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. If we don't have any more questions from the audience, I do see that Wesley is connected, and maybe we should thank you, Farah, for your presentation and move to the next speaker in the program. Wesley Koskei, I'm sorry for mispronouncing your name. Fundraising content manager, Amref Health Africa. Welcome to the program. Welcome to Water and Communications. Your session is called Who Owns the Story?
Thank you very much.
And I will leave the floor to you.
Thank you very much. You didn't mispronounce it, so one bit, I think.
Thank you.
And for the introduction. So again, my name is Wesley. I work for Amref. It's an African-based, African-led non-profit based in Nairobi. And today we're going to talk about who owns the story. I know that when we are telling stories, we always consider that story, especially I have a background in journalism, and probably from my time as a journalist, we'd always consider that the story belongs to the byline. But then over the last couple of years, we've had, questions around ethics, about who really owns the story. And as an organization, my presentation really would be about a research we did about this ownership of storytelling. And in fact, all this based on the fact that, I think as an organization, we were sort of alive, I think, and aware that Africa as it is, and I think many organizations or nonprofits that have worked here have been part of a system that has contributed and perpetuated stereotypes. And as as we may know, is that the thing about stereotypes, as I think Chimamanda says, is it's not that it's not true, but it's just that they're incomplete, and that has it sort of has the impact of making that one story about a person or about a place or about a people or a society to become the only story. So in 2021. Amref, together with the universities, 2 universities in the UK, did a collaboration in which they did a research in terms of, what would happen, at the time, theoretically, if a nonprofit ran a charity story and one that was led by a contributor who is from the community, by designing and deciding on what will be the result of that. So the eventualities of it is that, this collaboration had quite a lot of, it was a nuanced approach was taken towards it. And, there was a bit of training because there was an identification of community health volunteers who would then be part of that research. And obviously, because Amref already was also going to do that. And on one hand, they were going to hire the usual professional photographers, then do the proper editorial work that they would normally do. And on this other hand, work with community health volunteers to develop a similar thing. And the result, or rather the objective, was to be able to share this with supporters or individual donors that we have in one of our offices based in the UK. And so and just the quote from Patrick, and which we thought was interesting, when during the time, the perspectives are different, because Patrick lives and works in Kibera. It's an informal settlement in Nairobi. And so he understands, he recognizes people, he knows faces, he knows names, he knows their histories. And for him, he says, and I'm going to just quickly read that, is that the best thing is that you are talking directly to the real people. They have the best knowledge, the true picture of what they're saying. And I think true words can never be said because, again, Patrick has that understanding. Patrick is the gentleman on the top right. That's him. But again, the research also involved other community health volunteers who were part of it. The decisions made, editorial decisions on the choice of images, in terms of the design of the appeal, all that was done by Patrick and the community health volunteer. And the two that you see, those are the two separate appeals that was sent out, sort of the campaigns that were designed. And this was in 2021. And at the time, COVID, obviously, it was at that point, sort of devastating families in that it's informal settlement. And Amref, obviously, given that that was urgent at the time, went with the story about we want to save lives of these communities in informal settlements. This is the charity base as we would normally do. But Patrick thought that, well, since I'm with these communities, for my perspective as community health volunteer who stays and lives here, well, I think COVID is a real issue, but I think the elderly, probably, is a story I would like to highlight more. So that is what Patrick exactly did. So his story was based on that, looking at the elderlies and how they are affected in that area. And the pack was sent out to about 1,800 people in the UK. These are regular donors of Amref, and it had two outcomes. One was the financial response. How did people respond to these two different fundraising campaigns? And obviously there was the emotional response to it. In fact, when this was sent out, the participant created packs. So the one that Patrick had created raised more money for the organization. In fact, 38%, around 40% of that, in just one quarter than the previous appeals. And in terms of the emotional connection, when we did that follow-up, people say they could relate that Patrick's story was more authentic. In fact, if you can see it, the image in front of you of the gentleman, he has a UNICEF t-shirt. So in fact, Patrick was just telling a story that he thought was more important. And the audiences or the donors felt that it was very authentic, and they felt that there was need, in fact, to listen to Patrick's angle to it. So that happened in 2021. And since then, I think there have been conversations internally about how then do we move this forward? What then happens, after this? And we've had quite a lot going on at the time. But again, those conversations have steered, I guess, and also informed our own ethical guidelines and how we go about it. As you can see, this is what Patrick decided to do. This was his design. The choice of the contributors or the interviewees, all that was his. And eventually when this was sent out, I don't want to say surprisingly, but yes, people related more and it felt that for him, this was really authentic and represented the picture. Despite that, in the other campaign, the images were brilliant. They were really good. The stories were well done. But again, there was that lens. People felt that there was an INGO lens that had been placed on that eventually. So this was a lesson. And I think after that, we have had those discussions about then how do we then move that forward. And I'm going to just share this quote. And you might, excuse me, you might be familiar about it. They say that until the lion learns to tell a story, the hunter will always be the hero. I think in other cultures, they say, until the lion learns to write, the hunter will always be the hero. So who is telling the story and who owns that story? From our perspective, at least we think, stories are about power. And this is what influenced us we went back and sat down and thought, how are we going to influence, internally the organization to be able to embrace this as well? And so we created an ethical guideline, I think, as is with many organizations, have been doing for the last couple of years, I think. But then considering what the lessons that we had learned, things we had experienced with, community health volunteers, like Patrick had said, and we only came up with 5 principles. We were thinking of an ethical guideline that would be people-centered. Are we, again, about the stereotypes? Are we telling nuanced stories? Is it just, excuse me, I think because many people would, whenever we want to tell a story about water, for example, is the assumption that the lives of those people are around water only? Do we forget that they are fathers or mothers or sisters? Or are they farmers? Or are they, because they also have their lives. And I think seeing them as partners and rather not just as benefactors, sort of it really affects the outcome of that. And so our approach was thinking about an approach that is people-centered. Again, going back to Patrick's story, authentic. And it's always, I think, very easy to see something that is authentic. So real stories about real people going through real experiences. And much important also is feeling collaborative. So I think this is more around co-creation. How do we create content, not just by us talking to communities about what matter to them in terms of, I guess, the programs we're implementing, but also in terms of the content creators that we work with. Is it just a top-down, or are we seeing it as a partnership? And then accountability. Are we able to recognize that as organizations or as people, there's a room to always improve at any point in time as well? I mean, just also again to remember, I don't know, many of you may have read Africa is Not a Country. I think it was a popular book when it came out. And one of the things that Deepo, following who wrote the book, says is that it's hard to imagine how a single Instagram post can break a region until you appreciate that it's not about a single photo, but the cumulative power of having these perceptions continually regurgitated with multiple generations. So it's just the massive impact and having to do this over time to a population or a society, and how that then influences the mental, sort of inclination towards the people. So for us, as we were learning from the research that we had done, we just thought that it would be important to put respect for the rights, preferences, and the well-being of people that we were talking about. And again, we understand that there are very many different ways to approach sourcing and sharing of stories. And all this, there's sometimes high stake. Each and every step that you would like to create or share a story, all these are high stake, or at least that's what we thought. Excuse me. So once again, stories are about power. And we've had to reevaluate, how we define and how we measure success in terms of how we were developing that ethical guideline moving forward internally. As an example, we were thinking, how do we give opportunities for people and communities to give us feedback? How do we modify the way not just communications work or how we are getting content, but on how programs work? Especially, how do we then get that feedback that this isn't working, and then how do you respond to those to that feedback? But I think really it always comes back to one thing and one thing alone: power. if you're looking at every situation through the lens of power, at least from my perspective, excuse me, if you're considering how your choices affect, the balance of power, and you're aware of your own position in this whole context and in the interaction, then we think that's one way of being in the right track. Because when you're telling a story, you have the power, or there's the power to decide what you want to tell. There's the power of whose story you want to tell, and there's the power of who is telling the story. So those three levels of it, I think really impacts the story, and realizing that is the top. I think it's very important to recognize always the dynamics of it. It became a really important lesson to us moving forward. And also one of the other thing, in terms of these steps, we were thinking about the whole process as it is, pre-production, production, and once we've come back from telling those stories, what else are we doing about it? And then finally, dissemination and use. How are we going to share it out? Is there a feedback loop at the end? So just in summary of what we've done in terms of the next step since that, is we developed an ethical guideline, and then we're in the process of developing a training module, and the module would then be used internally. First is to think about internal audiences. How do you influence them? Because they are the first important stakeholders to this. And then coming up with the decision-making metrics. These metrics would then be used at the different levels. So at the planning stage, who then decides at the post-production, at, all those levels. And the most important one is creating storytelling champions. So these champions, again, internally, recognizing from the different departments, who are these influences that we can take advantage of, or who have an influence in the organization to be able to be ambassadors and champions. And for us, we're working sort of laterally, but then also thinking about communities. So the three highlighted in red have been the most important for us, thinking about the communicators and fundraisers who obviously would sort of the storytellers of the organization, but also not forgetting the program colleagues, because they are with communities every day. So they become the first sort of champions, and also the communities. People like Patrick are very important because they become the champions of these ethics, and they are able to stand up and say, hey, no, I think I do not like, or I don't want you to tell my story in that way, because that does not represent who we are as a people. And that really becomes important, again, in terms of power dynamics. The other thing that we have done, besides creating the ethical guidelines as internally, is that it also influenced us coming up with a global marketing proposition. And considering everything that we had learned from that. And one of the things is, we think people say, oh, ethical guidance sometimes will restrict us, but then there are so many opportunities that come out of it. And ethics doesn't have to be boring or restrictive. And, the outcome of that research really influenced our rationale to how we created a new marketing proposition, the visual identity of it, which you can see, and the messaging of it. Because we wanted a marketing proposition that gave people the feeling that they are part of a movement. They could be a small group, but they are growing as a community, and they're making a sort of meaningful and measurable difference, as supporters or as donors of Amref. So it really influenced us and how we were placing communities, excuse me, into those propositions as well. And in terms of, of some of the lessons is the contributors' representation in the marketing propositions. How are we placing the contributor? Is it reporting, or is it firsthand? Where are we placing their voice? So that was really important in influencing, and then it really influenced how we get to tell those stories. And our thought was that letting communities guide the way with ideas and sort of allowing them an opportunity to exercise their power. Not really allowing them, but just acknowledging that they have a place to exercise their power in storytelling, and loosening their grip in terms of, sort of not going with the box and saying, the stories have to fit in this box. And this sort of reminds me of visiting Uganda, where we want to tell a story about sanitary pads, and that's the story we want to go, to come out of. But then when you speak to the girls and women, they say, well, that's important, but for us, we don't have water. So why are we telling stories about sanitary pads? So I think listening to some of this also influences how we get to tell those stories. And finally, I guess some takeaways is to always think about the internal audience, that they matter. They are the first champions that we have, and always listening to communities, and that they have the power. And in terms of the 4 things that I would at least hope we can go away with, is always consider the dignity of people. They have their sense of agency. Stereotype. What's on the other side? What's the complete story? What else would you rather, what other thing would they want to tell us? And informed consent. What does it mean to you as a person? Do they know how we'd like to depict their communities? Would we consider a feedback loop where the communities also become part of the process, so that they can come back and see how the imagery or their stories have been used? Are they aware about how, the impact of their stories? And I guess in summary is that the process is as good as the outcome. What you put in terms of getting the stories, telling those stories, we think it will determine, or will tell us how good, your outcome will tell, your process will tell us how good that outcome is as well. So thank you very much. I'll be happy to also share some of the stats and the research and how it went, but I'm happy to take any sort of questions if you have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wesley. And I'm just going to echo what Shelley just wrote. Excellent presentation and very powerful. Thank you. Ethical storytelling is so very important. So thanks for being on the workshop. And if you have any questions to Wesley, you can just write them in the chat. And I so long until, while people are typing, I'd like to know, have you had any interest from other NGOs or maybe INGOs that wanted to find out more about your research or learn more from the work that you've done?
Yeah, thank you very much, Görrel. I get sort of interests quite very often from different organizations. Organizations like IPES, we've had conversations about over, I think because, we don't want knowledge to be autocratic. We want it to be democratic, about people to learn, and as I guess, as nonprofit sector, it's important that this is taken. So we've gotten quite a lot of interest with that. At the International Fundraising Conference, we've done quite a lot of presentations, and people have expressed interest, and we're happy to hear that they want to give this a try as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And Harriet has asked a question that I also think is very important. How do you move away from local partners telling you the stories they think you want to hear, and not tell you the stories they think you want to hear, and move away to stories they really think that are really important to tell you?
Thank you, Harriet. I think that's a really good question. So it's also quite expensive. This process, from the lessons I've had, is that it's quite expensive. We have taken the step to think about spending time with these communities. So, for example, if as an organization, you normally, many organizations will just go and come back just in a day or two, but consider, for example, creating a sense of familiarity with those communities. If you, in terms of your process, you add an extra day, so again, there's a cost to it, where you're not getting the story, but you just want to get acquainted so that you know them. As a person, I want to know you. I just don't want to tell you a story. So there is a bit of that nuanced approach to it, understanding that they're not just a subject to a story, quote unquote. They are people with a sense of urgency. So there's a cost to it, but I think it's worth it, because then you also get better and richer stories when you put that into your schedule. Thank you.
And would, just a follow-up question to that, would it also mean, or I'm thinking, if you spend more time there, then the local communities get to know you better, and they understand that you actually want to hear what is important to them and not what they think you would like. I mean,
yeah, exactly, because
they gain your trust in a different way.
That's the word, Görrel. It's about trust. You want to tell our story of sanitary pads, but the story really is that we don't have the water, which also affects our hygiene as women and girls. So it's really just, before somebody opens up to you, they will not do that in the 2 hours that you're there. You will need time for them to gain that trust, at least. Yeah.
And trust sometimes takes time, as you said. Karen asks, thanks for a great presentation. Can you explain further how you build feedback loops with communities into your communication processes?
Thank you, Karen. So there are several ways that first of all is happening, and what we are also trying to do. One of them is that after coming back from from a trip, the first thing we can, even before you leave, whether it's that location, is for those communities to be able to see the output of what you have. Print, there's small steps like printing that photos in a small Photoshop, in a small shop, and take it to them and say, look at the images that we did of you. Are you happy with them? So that's the first level of it. Are they happy? So when they receive it, for communities that I have visited in local areas in Zimbabwe, they don't have images that they can hang, but then that becomes a first step where they see the outcome of that. The second level is if they see a social media ad that you have printed, and they're able to come and see how then that goes into it, it closes it. The second level is we work as an organization in different countries. And so making sure that, first of all, the program colleagues who are in the different countries are able to review the stories so that you don't place anything in the context, and that will be sent to the local partners. So it's sort of creating a chain that then closes the loop as well, because everybody then becomes a participant in the story that you have ultimately.
Thank you very much. We also have from Dharma, do you think the importance of diversity in storytelling that allows variety of voices and perspectives help gain a more comprehensive understanding of stories, since it encourages society really to maybe seek out different narratives, question dominant narratives, and also strive to inclusivity in the stories we tell and consume?
So I will unpack the question because it's quite a good question. So first of all, I think it's simple. I think I think the diversity is what makes us stronger people. First of all, I think that. But then the beauty of stories is that there's no one similar story to the other. If we have 7 billion people, there are 7 billion different stories to tell. So yes, if we can a water story can have 7 elements to it, but then rather than thinking about the geographical, I would say, differences that we have, what are the emotional connections that cut through all these people? I guess the variety of voices are important in terms of, in terms of what has been the dominant conversations around the world. Is it that, as an example, when we just come back from Ethiopia, one of the things that the conversations that was going on was about delivering healthcare to its last mile project. How then do we change that story from, oh, look, this is what the communities here need, sort of from an approach of a charity to just as a mom who just wants their babies to have a healthcare. So just, I think, making these stories as individual as possible, but also having an emotional connection where people can invest their interest in. Because I think somebody, somewhere in the market cannot really relate to that. But then as a mom or as a dad, they can be able to relate what it will take for them to have their children as well. And in terms of inclusivity, think of it as you want everyone's story to be told. No one's story is better than the other, but how then do you prioritize? As an example, how do you prioritize women and girls stories over, looking at the cultures that you're working in? I think is also very important, because different cultures would have quote unquote different rules to it. But then how then do you make sure that none of those people are left behind in what you're doing, and also not doing harm to them? If you think your story will do harm to them, then there is no need to tell those kinds of stories, in my view.
Thank you. Gabriella, I'm going to read out for the recording, but you can also see here Wesley in the chat. I agree with going back to the communities after the process and inform them on what will happen next. It happens that communities do not want to talk or spend any more time telling their stories because there is no change to them. When approaching communities, it creates hope for them. So how do you approach this fact in your experience?
It's a tricky one, Gabriella, because hope is a dangerous thing. It's a good thing, but it's also quite dangerous because it means you have taken somebody to a different level. I think as a sector, it's something that we probably need to have more conversations around. I don't think I have quite a straight answer about that, but from our perspective, for example, I have had an experience where we met a young nurse when she was training in South Sudan. She was almost clearing. And part of really making sure that they understand that there's progress is having to go back. So 2 years later, we're just preparing to just go back and meet them again. So there is progress to it. And I think sometimes it's you might be lucky that there has been some progress since the other time, but I think if you're working with local partners or you have local communities, it's good to keep track, especially of those influencers who then sort of quote unquote as the face of those communities. There is no one straight answer, again, Gabriella, but I think just being, working together with program people is also quite important, because otherwise the story could be progressing, but the program is not progressing. So it shows sort of an imbalance in terms of what's the reality versus what, you're trying to tell. So I think there should be an alignment and synergy between the programs and comms as well, so that the story also works with what you're trying to do.
Thank you. That was the last question. Thank you very much, Wesley. I can just agree with everyone who's been praising this very interesting and very important presentation for us as journalists and communicators. It's now time to introduce the last speaker of the day, Thomas B. Moeslund, Professor in AI, Technical Faculty of IT and Design, Aalborg University in Denmark. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
And you are going to help us demystify AI. So please, the floor is yours.
Did that work?
We hear you. It's like a big echo. Do you have earphones, perhaps? Headphones?
No, I don't. But can you see the slide?
No, we
No?
can't see the slide.
Oh.
Can you perhaps share your screen? otherwise?
I was under the impression I shared the screen. I can try again.
Now that looks much better, much more promising.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. And should I do something with the audio, or is it?
Yeah, the audio is a bit weak, so it would be good if you could turn up your microphone on your computer. If you go on the mic settings, you should have the ability to increase the intake.
Then I'll probably have to read. Mic is all the way up, so sure. Okay, I'll just have to speed up then.
Yes.
Speak closer to the mic.
I shall do that. If I forget, then please let me know.
I think the sound is good now.
It's good. Okay. And I'm trying to share again.
So you're sharing your screen now. It's just about to be perfect.
Yes. Yes. So sorry about that. Yes, so my name is Thomas. I'm a professor within AI. I have worked with AI for 30 years, and I've been asked to try to say a little bit about it in this forum here. So yeah, so this might be something completely different, so please bear with me. And also when we talk about artificial intelligence, I mean, this is something you can take an entire degree on, right? And I have, 20 minutes to talk about it. So I'll, of course, do my best. And what I want to do is basically to talk a little bit about what it is, some of the dilemmas it comes with, and then basically the question that a lot of domain experts I'm talking to now, as I understand it, it's journalists, they are thinking, and that is basically, am I going to be replaced by an AI? So I'll return to that in the end. So I have been working with using AI to do all kinds of things, and most of them involving images. So here are just some random examples with water, because this is about water, right? So where we are using it on a robot in the sewer systems to basically figure out if there are defects or the water level, stuff like that. We are using it on the water. We have had cameras mounted for 3 years, 9 meters under the water, to basically understand what kind of biodiversity we have down there. And we're doing it also in aquariums to understand the behavior of small zebrafish and stuff when you change the environment. But most recently, I have also found an interest in, because now these technologies are kind of working, and that means they go into society. So therefore, I've also picked up an interest in what happens when it actually enters society. And we've been fortunate to have some funding to investigate this responsible AI notion. Yes, and this is what I'm talking a little bit about. But first, if there are a few people out there who are a little bit puzzled what AI is, even though a lot of people have been talking about it the past, especially 5 years, I would say to those people that is completely understandable, because AI is very, very poorly defined. You can, of course, Google different definitions and look at different organizations who have kind of their own definition of AI. But the fact is, we don't have a very scientific, valid definition of AI. And therefore, it becomes a little bit confusing for everybody, also when we are to talk about it. But I think some of the best definitions is basically to think of it as technology that can do something that we only thought humans could do. And by having this kind of vague definition, I'm also trying to underline the fact that this is something that changed over time. So back in the days around the Second World War, when it was defined the first time, people were talking about a machine that could play chess as an example of something that would be artificial intelligence. So we have that today, right? Many people have it on their phone, and now it's not AI anymore. It's just an app, right? So right now, artificial intelligence is something about chatbots and robots and autonomous vehicles, but in 5 years, it might be something completely different. Yes. Then when we talk about AI, currently there are 3 terms that is being, I would not necessarily mixed up, but they are at least being used a lot. And they are organized like this. So one is AI, and it came around, as I said, the Second World War. And basically, AI are algorithms that uses rules. So it's basically some technology and a piece of software normally that would basically have some input data, and then it would go through something like, if this happens, and this happens, and this doesn't happen, and this happens to that degree, then my decision is this. And in today's world, we have millions and millions of these algorithms around us. We never think about it, and we never call them AI, but this is actually AI per definition. Then at some point in time, these rules sometimes became so complicated to define that some people came up with the idea, why don't we use data to learn the rules directly? So take some data where you have some, here are some input, and you would like the system to act like this an output. So you have these input and output relations. And then you could actually use that to train a system that then would automatically learn these rules. Algorithms that does so, they are coined machine learning. It's still AI, it's just data-driven AI. Then to be precise, in 2012, something spectacular happened in the world of AI. We had for a long, long time known roughly how the human brain works. I mean, don't get me wrong, but at least that it is organized into neural nets. And the moment people found that out in the 50s, it was possible to make a mathematical model of that. And that is called an artificial neural network. And they have been around for a long time, but they have not really worked until the summer of 2012, where there was a breakthrough. And a long story short, the breakthrough was basically that you should just make the neural network, the artificial neural network, bigger. And that was shown by a PhD student in the summer of 2012. And then suddenly it started to work really, really impressive. And this notion of making the neural network bigger, that is sometimes referred to as making it deeper. And that's why the name deep learning has been used. So deep learning basically just means an artificial neural network of a certain size. And if you want to kind of understand the big paradigm shift that came along with this introduction of deep learning, that's what I've tried to illustrate with this figure here. So basically the figure has 2 parts, the upper part, which is a traditional machine learning system, and then the lower part, which is a deep learning system. So imagine that you were faced with a task of making an algorithm that could take an input of a person, and then it could classify which person that is. To solve a problem like that, you would start by calling an expert, somebody like me, who knows images and who knows to write software that can kind of extract features or some entities from images. So I would look at this problem and say, okay, I probably have to extract something about the shape of the face, the distance between the eyes, the amount of hair and stuff like that. So I would program that into a system and then make a classifier that could basically use that data or these features to distinguish between the different input here persons, but it could be anything. The new thing that came along with deep learning, so there are 2 things. So one was this neural network that I talked about. The other thing was that instead of having an expert like me defining what the system should look for, we simply ask the network to figure out by itself what it should look for. So this is a huge paradigm shift in the sense that there's no longer a human in the loop. And these technologies work. I mean, people like me who work with images are very impressed with what they can do. And a lot of other people really got to know neural networks or deep learning when ChatGPT and similar services were launched. It's basically the same algorithm that runs for the images and the text. So we're now standing in a situation where we have technology, at least AI technology, that works very, very well. And that also means, of course, that this technology will go out into the world. And this is where it becomes a little bit potentially problematic. And I'll give you a few examples of this. So there's a lot of information here. Never mind that. Yeah, I cannot help show this picture because this particular figure in the upper left corner, that is actually the neural network that the PhD student showed in 2012 that started the revolution of AI we're in right now. But there's a lot of detail here. But if you focus on the numbers in the gray box, then I have summarized the number of neurons in this artificial net he did. And it's approximately similar to what we have in the mind of a bee. Then there is what is called the number of free parameters. That's basically the number of, think about it as small screws you have to tune in before this can work, right? So there's 60 million of these. So when we talk about training an AI algorithm, that means that we use data to figure out automatically how should these 60 million small wheels be tuned, right? And what this means a lot of things, but one of the things this means, that is that if you go to, let's say you go to the doctor, he runs some of your data through an AI model, and the model then comes out and say you're going to die tomorrow, and you then ask the doctor, why is that? Then you're actually asking the question, what is the relationship between 60 million parameters? And of course, nobody knows that. Nobody can answer that question. And that means that we have technology now that works really well. You give it some input and you have a really good output, but you don't really know what's going on inside the algorithm. And this is why it's referred to as a black box technology, which of course comes with a lot of problems. Another issue, which has been very, very big the last 2 or 3 years, is this notion of fake data. We have always had engineers like me or computer scientists who have tried to make algorithms that can generate as good fake data as possible. Here is an example of face images. So these are the best face images. This is of persons who do not exist, right? The best face images that has been generated across time. And around 2016, 17, this is where deep learning is starting to be used in this domain. And today we're at a point where you can easily generate a face image and nobody in the world will be able to see if it's fake or if it's real. And this is not only true for images, this is now also true for text, for speech, for music, for video, and so on and so forth. And you could say a lot about this, but I normally say 2 things about this. The first point is what I've tried to illustrate to the left here. This stick figure I've drawn here, this is literally how creative I can be. I'm very bad at drawing. So yeah, this is not something I do. The image below that, I also did that with technology, right? And I spent 30 seconds on it. And I think this is a very, very beautiful image. So this means that now I have gone from being, you know, a pure amateur when it comes to any expressing myself with drawings to actually be an artist. And of course, this is not only me, because anybody can get access to these tools. So this means now that we have most of the population of Earth will in a few years have access to unfold their creativity, not only with images, but also with sound, with text, with anything. And just imagine what that can do. I mean, personally, I think it's super, super positive that we all can release our creativity in this way. The other side of the coin, of course, is what we see to the right, where it means you can, of course, use exactly the same technology to generate fake information, harmful information, information that can basically undermine, if we do not take care, the democracy, the trust in what we see, what we read, and all that. This is, and of course, it had always been like that you can generate something that is fake, but it's so easy and it's so cheap. So this is a huge problem. So we have this dilemma with these new technologies. And of course, one of the responses to that is that we will need some kind of regulation. And here this is from the EU where I'm sitting, that there are three things, bigger things coming up. And let me show you another example. So now I'm going to show you a person being killed, if the video will run. So if you don't like to see people dying, then close your eyes. It's just 1 minute. So this is taken from an autonomous driving vehicle, and it kills the person right there. So, and of course, the question is, so on one hand, again, we now have technology that is so advanced so it can drive our vehicles, right? This is really crazy if you think about it. But at the same time, this is not perfect. So this means that it will ultimately harm and, of course, kill people. So we are in this ethical dilemma. You know, right now, people would probably say technology should not be able to kill people, which is a fair point. But if you zoom a little bit out, and then you would argue that, well, if all vehicles on the planet were driven by AI, then probably less people will die each day. So what's right here? And of course, this is an ethical question. And that means that this is real. So that means that there will be a lot of legislation internationally, nationally, to figure out how are we going to govern this. And it's not obvious what to do here. Yes. Then as I started by saying, I mean, basically what I'm trying to do with this last slide here is to say, what if I am to look just a little bit into the future? So a lot of people are asking, what's going to happen with this AI? And of course, nobody knows. But here are at least some from my chair, how I see it. I think there are a lot of drivers out there now. The B and C levels in companies, they are finally beginning to understand AI. So we now see evidence decision taking regarding AI in businesses and organizations. I think it's also a driver that going a few years back, all these big models, AI models, they were only owned by the tech company. They are being democratized as we speak. So everybody would have access to this very, very soon. All this talk about we are using all our power on these AI model, that's true to some degree right now. That will go away very soon. So it will be very cheap to use. And I think there will also be a push that citizens and customers, they will actually expect AI in a few years. So we have to embrace this somehow. So these are some of the drivers I see. Of course, there's a lot of opportunities here. I'd like to point to the last one especially. I think you have to embrace the notion that within few years, of course, I don't know how many, we will each have a virtual personal assistant. We will have an AI that basically knows us very, very well and are able to do things on our behalf. And what that means for the individual and for society, who knows? But I think we should prepare for that. What you should pay attention to, I would point to, there's many things, but I would point to these three things. I'm sorry for my language, but I'm sick and tired of hearing of people saying either AI is going to take over the world, I don't care, I don't want to live anymore, or AI is hallucinating, it's not working, I will never use that technology again. I'm really, really tired of hearing that. You should rather think of AI, what you have right now is just something, and in tomorrow it will be better, and in 5 years it will be completely different, and it will be much more advanced. So therefore, I also recommend to everybody, individuals, organization, etc., you need, of course, to play around with what's around now. You know, can you use ChatGPT for anything? If you can't, then don't use it. But at the same time, you should also start thinking about, well, it might be I cannot use ChatGPT right now because it's hallucinating and blah, blah, blah. But that will stop in a few years. What can I then use it for? And what can I use AI, generally speaking, for? And then the last thing I'll point to is this idea of, as I had with the autonomous cars, that right now we will, of course, say technology should never harm people. But I will challenge that. That will go away soon. You will accept that technology would harm people. Of course, I'm formulating a little bit strict right now, but I think that will go away. So I would also pay attention to that. And then for the journalists among you, this question I get every time I talk to domain experts. So what will happen with my domain? And of course, I don't know. but here is probably my best guess. There is this saying that I mean, your job and company, I'm not sure it will be overtaken by AI, but I'm pretty sure it will be overtaken by other companies, organizations, and persons who are using AI. So this is the same as to say, embrace it. It will, of course, be used. It already started to be used for something like writing, editing, summarization, fact-finding, all these more tedious tasks, you could say. But we are not far away from a journalist would just write a story, or an AI would write a story, and then it would become personalized because we have profiled each an individual very soon on the social media, right? So this is a tremendously powerful tool. So I think people will also have to embrace that if they're working with journalism. And then, like we see when we talk to medical doctors, for example, and other domain experts, we're talking about if the role would change so much that in the future, journalists' jobs will more be overseeing and perhaps interpreting what comes out of the AI agents. Of course, this is guesswork, but this is, I think, yeah, at least one aspect to consider.
Thank you very
To summarize, I just have one more.
One more, okay, one more.
And then I'm done. I think you have to embrace that the world without AI is not an option. So it's not going to go away. With the rise of the internet and the mobile, I mean, you cannot now imagine a job, a person, anything who does not use these technologies, and it will be the same with AI. Yes, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Lena just has a comment here. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. I agree that AI should not be considered as an enemy, but rather can be a very useful tool to perform tasks. But we have to keep in mind that human touch is always needed in the use of it. Thank you, Lena, for that comment. If you have ever comments or questions, put them in the chat. We have something here from Hillary. Thanks all for the fascinating presentations today. You have to leave, Hillary. I see you on Friday, hopefully. Thanks a lot. Thomas, I was thinking you were talking a little bit about regulations. And there is a lot of discussions and debates and talks about regulations. Should AI be regulated in what way and how we're going to do it, as you say, is not obvious. But what is your take on it? I mean, you have after all studied this a lot. You are a professor in AI, so I'm interested to hear your view.
Yes, I think actually
so, Thomas, can you speak the way you spoke during your presentation?
Okay, sorry. Oh, yeah, I'll come closer to. Is that better or?
No, it's more or less the same. During the presentation, your sound was really, really good.
Really? Okay.
It's just the mic that seems to take a few minutes to catch your voice, but you're fine now.
You're fine.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. I think the approach that has been taken in EU with the AI Act is promising in the sense that it doesn't regulate the individual type of algorithm. Instead, it regulates the use of it. So it classifies, it's not so much which algorithm you're using, it's what you're using it for. So it classifies the use cases into how severe are they for individuals and for society. And I think that's a nice approach. So that's one answer. The other answer is everybody who has been working with this know that what comes out now here and in the US and other places around the world will just be the first go at this. Because this is something that is evolving, and how are we going to regulate something that is evolving? For example, right before they were about to sign here in the EU, the AI Act, generative AI became very big. It's been there for many years, but it became very big. and they didn't have that explicitly in the text. So they had to revise the text, right? And this is just to say that we don't know where we are in 2 years, so we will have to go back and iterate. So I think this will be an iterative process across time.
Right. Sarah, I'm not sure if you can answer this, Thomas, but we can maybe try all of us together. Sarah says, is there any direct connection between the AI conversation and the implications for communicating about the water sector? Examples. If any of you in the program today participating have any examples of this, please write in the chat box, or maybe write directly to Sarah who asked the question. And we are moving on. Is there any more? Here's a question from Ahmed. In the rapidly evolving field of AI, and considering the necessity of embracing AI concepts, how can you help us accelerate our understanding and acceptance of AI to keep pace with the times, given its inevitability and the disadvantage of not engaging with it?
I think I will go back to this point I had, that I always recommend a twofold strategy.
So play around with what's out there right now. If it doesn't fit your whatever you're doing, then don't use it. But play around with it. Don't just ignore it. And then at the same time, start thinking about what will happen in the long run. I mean, we cannot predict what the technology will be in 5 years, and we cannot predict what the public opinion will be, and we cannot predict what the regulation will be. But so therefore, you should not fix your mindset right now regards to how are you going to use or embrace AI forever. But do something now and then think about it. What if this happens? What if that happens? And how would that affect you and your organization in 5-10 years?
Thank you. Thank you very much. We are slowly running out of time. And both Sarah and, sorry, I missed that, our piece of conversation. And Samar is asking about how does this relate to water and communication. And I just like to point out that we do have another session on AI coming up later in the program, where we're going to look more deeply into AI, climate change, and we're also going to then see a little bit more what it does to fake news and misinformation and disinformation. So this first session was just like a little bit of opening up for AI. And if I'm not mistaken, it's June 27. We have our second AI session focusing more on water and climate and AI more directly. And yes, then we'll have, Ahmed, your question, how can AI contribute to the sustainable management of water resources in regions severely affected by climate change? I think we'll take those questions for the June 27 session when we are dealing more with AI and water and climate, focusing on that. As for now, thank you very much, Thomas, for joining us. And thanks to every one of you who has joined Water and Communications first episode of 2024. The full program of World Water Week has now been launched, and you can watch that on www.worldwaterweek.org. Registration is also open for World Water Week online or on site. So please watch the site and find out more.